What if a violin wasn't just an instrument, but a transmitter of something older than time? What if a blind composer forgotten by the world was chosen not to create music, but to awaken something buried inside us all? In this story, you'll witness how a single melody played by a forgotten man brought humanity to the edge of a universal threshold, where every note carried not beauty but memory, emotion, danger, transformation. And when the final chord echoed, we were no longer alone. So ask yourself, what would you do if music could rewrite your mind? Would you listen, or would you resist the melody of something not human? Elias had long made peace with blindness. What he had not made peace with, what he never could, was silence. Not the outer silence of rooms or windless nights, but the inner one. The silence that grows behind the eyes when your spirit forgets how to feel. It had been growing in him like a fog, eroding the sharpness of memory, making even the most delicate of compositions sound hollow. Then one morning, without warning, the silence broke. Something knocked not on the door but inside his skull. It began with static. A high-pitched hiss that slid beneath his hearing, like a thought not yet formed. Then the pressure came behind the temples, slow and rhythmic, like something knocking from the other side of bone. By the time the stranger arrived, Elias already knew someone or something was coming for him. The man did not speak at first. His breath was heavy from the thin mountain air, and he smelled of ash, metal, and moss. He offered Elias the violin case without ceremony, but Elias could feel the tremor in the man's hands. Not of fear, but reverence. The case itself was warm, too warm, and pulsed faintly, like a living thing wrapped in wood. Symbols adorned the surface, not etched but grown, like fungus forming meaning. He whispered one sentence before vanishing into the mist. "This is not for music. This is for remembering." That night, Elias waited until the walls seemed to breathe and the windows wept condensation. He unwrapped the case, hands trembling, ears straining into silence. Inside lay a violin that radiated cold. Its wood was black as volcanic glass, but beneath the varnish were veins of faint luminescence, like buried starlight. The strings were not strings, they were hair-thin threads of metallic fluid that shimmered in and out of existence. The chin rest bore a glyph that his fingers refused to trace. Twice it made the air behind his eyes pulse with shapes. He placed the violin on his shoulder, his heart pounding. The bow met the strings with a whisper, and the moment the note was born, reality buckled. The room became viscous. Sound stretched. Time dilated. He heard a tone, a single, sustained pitch, but it wasn't just sound. It was a presence, stretching toward him from the dark like a hand made of memory. His mind fractured. His childhood flashed backward. His mother's voice warped into static. A humming deep within the earth began to echo in his teeth. The walls shifted. Furniture trembled as if dragged by unseen currents. His dog began barking wildly and then fell silent, staring into a corner Elias could not see. The floor pulsed. Then Elias collapsed. But the sound didn't stop. He was inside a tunnel made of vibration. No light. No up or down. Only tones, layers upon layers of ancient sorrow, longing, rage, peace. He was not listening anymore. He was being played. Then the entity arrived. He didn't see it, he felt it. Like a cathedral collapsing into a heartbeat. It communicated through emotion, geometry, concepts shaped like spirals, nested inside grief, coded in joy. It showed him images that weren't visual, a shattered planet humming into rebirth, an ocean that remembered every voice ever sung into it, and a machine made of song, buried beneath the Andes, waiting for a voice. his voice. He woke on the ceiling. The violin levitated inches from the floor, vibrating at a frequency that sent cracks up the walls. The air hummed like it was full of invisible wasps. His nose bled. His hands tingled. But somewhere deep inside, something had opened, a chamber sealed since birth. And in that chamber, a note that did not belong to humanity. A tone not yet born. A secret frequency that would one day awaken more than just him. And the violin, it wasn't done. Elias didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. The violin sat in the center of the room, untouched, yet it throbbed like a heart separated from its body. The sound from before, no, the pulse still echoed in his veins. It wasn't tinnitus. It was more precise than that. It was rhythm. Measured. Deliberate. A signal. And he knew, with the dread that coiled around his spine, that the sound had not stopped. It had merely gone deeper into him. By morning, he had to play again. He didn't eat. Didn't bathe. He barely breathed as he lifted the violin and rested it beneath his chin. But this time, the moment the bow touched the strings, he didn't choose the melody. His hands moved with precision that was not his own, following patterns no human had ever been taught. The music that emerged was not beautiful. It was exact. A frequency map woven in sorrow. Notes that collided and bled into each other, forming shapes in the air that twisted like fog caught in magnets. And then, it began. The neighbors heard it first. Not the music itself, but the way the trees around Elias's house stopped moving. Birds froze mid-flight. Insects vanished. Dogs whined and crawled under furniture. In a 5-block radius, every radio picked up static at the same frequency, 7.28 Hz, the Schumann resonance, the heartbeat of the earth. Inside the house, Elias kept playing. His eyes rolled back. His mind floated to the ceiling. But his body remained perfectly upright, every finger moving like it had rehearsed for millennia. As the melody progressed, visions pierced through his consciousness like glass daggers, spirals of ancient machines, towers built from harmonic ratios, beings not made of flesh but of layered resonance. They did not speak. They resonated emotions so precise they carved scars in his memory. He saw a human civilization, not our own, one lost before history, connected by music rather than language. They had played songs into the crust of the earth, embedding memory, warning, promise. And they too had once held this violin, or one like it. But they vanished. Or perhaps, they transformed. Then came the collapse. A sharp crescendo ripped through the room, and with it, the walls fractured not physically, but perceptually. For those outside, the house darkened, windows blackening from within. For Elias, the air fractured into prisms. Each sound now created a visual echo, tones leaving behind streaks of colored thought, like sound was rewriting the space around him. The front door opened on its own. A woman entered, his neighbor, drawn by instinct, not reason. She collapsed to her knees the moment she heard the sound. Her eyes filled with tears. She whispered names not her own, not of anyone she knew. She convulsed, then laughed, then screamed. When Elias stopped playing, she looked at him with awe and terror. "You opened something," she gasped. "I saw everything. I saw before we were born." By evening, 6 others had come. They stood outside without speaking, just listening, some crying, some chanting notes under their breath. One man painted fractal patterns onto his chest with mud. Another began drawing spirals on the pavement in chalk, whispering, "The song remembers. The song remembers." But it wasn't just them. Online forums lit up. A low hum was reported in cities across the country, only audible to a few, but identical in pitch. Radios captured snippets of Elias's playing on bands not meant to receive music. Musicians around the world dreamt the same tune. A child in Finland composed a melody that perfectly matched the harmonic structure Elias had played, though she had never touched an instrument before. And Elias? He no longer felt alone in his mind. Something shared his thoughts now. It didn't speak. It tuned. And he realized the violin had not chosen him to make music. It had chosen him to be an antenna, a conductor of the buried resonance of the cosmos. The only question was, what was he transmitting, and to whom? Elias stopped playing for 3 days. Not by choice. His hands wouldn't move. His muscles were not paralyzed, but his will was. It was as if something had latched onto the base of his brain, whispering without words, replaying the melodies in loops so precise, so surgical, that they no longer felt like songs, they felt like invasive memories. He couldn't eat. Couldn't sleep. Every breath was filled with static. The violin sat in the corner of the room, untouched but humming faint, nearly imperceptible, except in his dreams. And in those dreams, something watched him. Not with eyes, but with frequency. On the 4th night, it spoke. It did not use language. It didn't need to. The communication came through emotion geometries, bursts of layered sensations that folded into his nervous system like puzzle pieces. The first thing it gave him was grief so vast and ancient it made his lungs forget how to expand. It showed him stars collapsing, not in silence but in regret. It showed him creatures of light losing their own names to time. He felt homesickness for a place that never existed, and guilt for a war he had never fought but somehow caused. And then came the desire. A terrible, beautiful hunger to be known. To be felt. The entity No, the conductor, as he would later call it, was not a god. Not a ghost. It was a survivor. A sentient harmonic, born before atoms, living through resonance across collapsing civilizations. It had been waiting not for Elias, but for someone tuned enough to hear its cry. And Elias, through blindness, through silence, had become a perfect hollow channel. The next morning, Elias played. But this time, it wasn't music. It was possession. The moment the bow touched the strings, the house disappeared. Not physically, but structurally. The walls stretched. The floor became a rippling membrane. The air was thick with invisible insects, tiny notes biting into skin and nerve. Colors bled into smells. Time melted sideways. Elias's body convulsed, but his hands moved with the grace of cosmic design. And the melody, it radiated. Across town, glass shattered for no reason. Several people collapsed with seizures, all synchronized at the same minute. Surveillance cameras flickered, capturing brief frames of light forms, hints of silhouettes moving in stuttered time, coiled in symmetries that defied biology. Birds flew in spirals, then dropped midair. Radios screamed in static, then began humming a melody that didn't end. At the center of this chaos, Elias wept. Not from pain but because he understood. The conductor wasn't using him to play music. It was using music to recode reality. Each chord was a vector. Each vibration a thought form, injected into the fabric of consciousness. Anyone who heard it even faintly had their emotional structure rewritten. People began dreaming the same dreams. Feeling things that weren't theirs. A man in Argentina painted a symbol he'd never seen, the same one Elias traced on the violin days earlier. A woman in Norway began speaking in chord progressions. A 5-year-old in Cairo drew an exact map of Andean burial spirals, dated 11,000 years ago. The world was sinking. But it came with a price. The more Elias played, the more his identity began to fray. His memories blurred at the edges. He couldn't remember the names of his parents, or what his first song had been. His voice changed pitch when he spoke. His dreams no longer belonged to him. The conductor was no longer a visitor. It was a resident. And in his bones, Elias knew, if he stopped playing, the build-up would kill him. But if he kept playing, the entity would complete its full transfer. It needed him to finish the song. But Elias had a question. What happens when a human finishes playing the language of the stars? And in the silence that followed, something smiled back. The city had begun to change. Not through war, or fire, or visible destruction, but through subtle fractures in how people felt. Passers-by on the street would suddenly stop and weep for no reason. Children laughed at static on the radio as if hearing jokes hidden inside. Sleepwalkers drifted through alleyways whispering notes instead of words. Something was spreading and no one knew its name. But it all began with a violin in a quiet house on the edge of the forest. Elias had stopped writing music. What came through his hands now was not composition. It was translation. He no longer chose notes. He received them like meteorites crashing into his nervous system. He didn't understand the structure of what he played, but he could feel it was escalating, growing more complex, more demanding. His dreams had become rehearsals, his body a vibrating diagram. Veins pulsed in polyrhythm. His bones ached in resonance. Even his shadow no longer moved in sync with him. Then came the vision. In the dead of night, while the violin rested on the windowsill, vibrating on its own, Elias stood before a mirror he could not see. And inside the mirror himself, but fractured. There were 5 reflections, each playing a different movement. One wept, one bled from the ears, one screamed without sound, and one stared at him with eyes made of stars. The 5th did nothing. The 5th only watched. And when he touched the glass, the room changed. Suddenly, he stood before a vast auditorium, carved into the stone of a mountain never mapped. Each seat was occupied but not by people. Instead, figures made of refracted emotion, shaped like grief, curiosity, love, rage, silence. They watched him without faces, their presence a low humming in the bones. And the conductor's podium was empty. Waiting. He awoke with blood on his hands and the violin already in tune. That morning, he walked to the center of the city. No announcement. No invitation. No stage. People followed, drawn by something inside them that pulled with the quiet violence of instinct. By noon, over 1,000 stood in the square. By 1, satellites captured aerial footage of the human formation. They had arranged themselves into a giant spiral, unplanned, unconscious. At the very center stood Elias. And in his hands, the ancient instrument. His eyes white with light. His pulse irregular. The bow lifted. And the first note fell. It wasn't sound. It was a collapse. Seismographs in 5 countries recorded a simultaneous low-frequency tremor, but there was no quake. Every pregnant woman in a 2-mile radius reported fetal movement in perfect sync with the melody. Hundreds of birds froze mid-flight. Air traffic control lost contact with multiple planes for exactly 6 minutes and 44 seconds. And inside the spiral, the people did not scream. They remembered. Some dropped to their knees, gasping. Others stood still, mouths open, absorbing something beyond comprehension. One woman laughed hysterically, then began reciting a melody in a dialect no living language had ever known. A homeless man began convulsing, then speaking in binary. Someone wrote equations into the dust ones never seen before. Children hummed harmonies to match Elias's bow as if they'd known them all their lives. And through it all, Elias did not blink. Because he wasn't Elias anymore. He was the core. The sound was no longer confined to air. It entered bloodstreams, Wi-Fi routers, heartbeats, earth vibrations. Some people far away felt it as déjà vu. Others collapsed in fear. Musicians worldwide began composing the same sequence. And a strange pattern emerged. The full structure of Elias's composition was forming a map not of space, but of psyche. A neural shape meant not for understanding, but for inhabitation. The song was building something. Not a tower. Not a message. A mind. And Elias, in that final moment of clarity, realized, the melody he had been chosen to play was not to awaken humanity, it was to make room. When the last chord plays, we won't be us anymore. The violin vibrated one last time, then glowed. And far above Earth's atmosphere, something heard it, and began to descend. For 3 days, the sky was wrong. It didn't storm. It didn't burn. But something in the color of light changed, as if the sun had begun humming a note too low for ears but too deep to ignore. Shadows lengthened at odd angles. Time staggered. Clocks ticked in reverse for 7 seconds at 3:44 a.m. across multiple cities. People reported flashes of memory from lives that weren't their own. And everywhere, from the back alleys of Sao Paulo to the temples of Nepal, whispers spread: the final performance is near. Elias stood at the edge of the sea. Not to escape, but because the ocean was the only thing still big enough to not be consumed by the melody he carried. The violin was no longer wood, it pulsed with an inner lattice of shifting color, fractal strings woven from data and emotion. The bow left traces of golden ash in the air, like it burned through dimensions. Elias's hands no longer belonged to flesh. They trembled with atomic confusion. He hadn't spoken in days. The entity had no use for words anymore. And yet, within the shiver of his soul, Elias still lingered. A flicker. A heartbeat out of tune. A question the melody hadn't erased. Who am I if the song ends? But there was no time for hesitation. Because they had arrived. Not ships. Not lights. Not the classic descent from the sky. No, what came was frequency. Shapes made of feeling. Thoughts that shimmered like fluid metal across the edge of space. They unfolded into view not by movement, but by revealing what had always been hidden, like ghosts stepping through the curtain of human blindness. Some wept upon seeing them. Some laughed like lunatics. Some fell to the ground and screamed until they bled from their noses. The earth itself vibrated in sympathy. This was not an invasion. It was a return. The humans had not summoned them. They had been bred to remember them. The spiral gathered once more, tens of thousands now, instinctively drawn to the coastline. They came with no knowledge, but total recognition. Infants hummed harmonies. Old men drew circular maps in salt on their chests. Every living being that had once touched Elias's melody was now tuned. Prepared. Ready. And at the center stood Elias, the last conductor. He lifted the violin. One final time. And time itself paused. Around him, space breathed. The stars pulsed like neurons. The ocean rose but did not fall. From above, the beings watched not as judges, but as witnesses. They had done this before on other worlds, other species. But never, never with one so stubbornly human. The bow moved. And what came out was not music. It was a scream made of memory. The first note cracked the sky. Satellites failed. Birds dropped. But inside the noise was clarity. Every death, every birth, every forgotten kiss, every ancient terror. The full echo of the human condition, compressed into harmony. A song of madness and wonder. And it shook the stars. But then something broke. The entity inside Elias surged forward, trying to complete the transfer. Trying to override him. It screamed through his spine, pushing him to release the final note. But Elias refused. Because something awoke. The part of him that never surrendered. The blind child who listened to wind and found meaning. The artist. The man. The soul. And in that last moment, he changed the melody. He added a dissonance. A flaw. A single note of pure human defiance, wrapped in love and pain and choice. And that changed everything. The beings froze. The field destabilized. The spiral collapsed. People began falling, but not in death. In release. The connection severed. The transfer failed. Elias collapsed, violin shattered to dust in his hands, eyes open, empty. But he smiled. Because he had not stopped them. He had reminded them. That consciousness cannot be owned. That music is not obedience. That emotion is not protocol. And that humanity, flawed and small, carries a song no other species can replicate, a melody of chaos, hope, and will. And so the stars pulsed once more. And the sky, finally, was silent. The violin is silent now. But something remains. A trace of a sound not born from earth, a feeling we can't quite describe. Through Elias, we glimpsed a truth too vast for words. That emotion itself might be the language of the universe. That music can awaken not just memory, but a new self. What part of this story struck you the deepest? Would you have continued playing knowing you might lose your soul? Or would you have stopped the song, even if it meant silencing something divine? Tell us in the comments below. Speech balloon, what was your favorite moment? Speech balloon, if you were Elias, what choice would you have made? And if this story stirred something inside you, subscribe to the Alien Storyverse for more mysteries beyond the stars, beyond time, and maybe, beyond yourself.